Hey everyone, I'm Luis Lopez, host of Atlas Linguae, and this is Season 3, The Language of Culture Online. This week we go all the way to Australia to hear from someone that I was really excited to talk to, Bernadette Kirwan. Bernadette is an Irish Palestinian content creator born and raised in Sydney. Her work often goes back and forth between sharing the joys of her parents' cultures and poking fun at their more eccentric aspects. We talk about the struggles she went through growing up with immigrant parents and not always being allowed to do what her classmates could. And we also learn about how she gradually opened up to all of her cultural backgrounds Arab, Irish, and Australian and found the balance to be able to celebrate them equally with joy. So, here's our conversation with Bernadette Kirwan. Enjoy! Bernadette, thank you so much for being with us today. How are you?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. Excited to talk to you about this. I feel like it's so interesting to hear about you and to see your work as someone who, from what I understand, oscillates between three different cultures, right? Three different cultural hubs: Ireland, Palestine, and Australia. Uh, could you tell me a little bit more about that? It's super broad of a question, I know,
Yeah.
but like, what was it? What was it like, growing up in Australia with such unique cultural identity for you?
It was probably another layer of, I don't want to say confusion, but another layer of figuring out, like, growing up, especially once you entered like your teenage years, you've got all these things to do with, like you
Yeah.
said, your identity that you're trying to figure out. And I guess now having, three cultures that I'm exposed to, mainly two, but essentially three, you've got that extra layer of figuring out that whilst perhaps initially there may be an element of, you know, confusion, you're in a little bit of a state of a loss because there's so much extra to consider, but eventually through a lot of experiences you figure it out, and you find a nice balance between it all.
I love that. So tell me more about growing up was it in Sydney? Did you grow up in Sydney?
Yeah, so I've spent most of my life in Sydney. I was born in Sydney, Australia, and I've lived here pretty much my whole life.
Great. So yeah, tell me about that. Like, for example, at school, how was the racial diversity at school? Did you feel in a way like unique, perhaps even lonely, or was there like some way that you felt integrated or connected to your classmates? What was that regarding your cultural background and identity?
Unique, yes, in the sense that I didn't know anybody else that was mixed. I didn't know
Okay.
anybody else that was, like myself. Like, if anybody was mixed, it was from within the same continent, so to speak. Like, for example, any Middle Eastern
Right.
friends that I met, they would be half Lebanese and half Palestinian, or something like that. Like, the mix would be
Right.
rather
Yeah.
similar. Whereas, yeah, so definitely unique in that sense. But lonely, yes, for a myriad of reasons. But in this context, I think, like I mentioned earlier, in just lonely in this context because I took a while to figure it all out, to find my, sense of balance between the appreciating the two
Oh
cultures.
no.
But yeah, school is a weird
Ah.
time because that's the time when you're most trying to figure out.
All
Hmm.
right. We're recording again.
Okay,
Okay.
awesome.
Great. Okay, cool. So, yeah, just if you'd like to continue with what we were talking about, you're talking about growing up and how you felt in school and
Yeah.
yeah, finding the balance in your life and like school being a weird time. So, yeah, if you'd like to just continue from there.
I guess for any teenager in school, particularly around like the high school years, which for in Australia is 7 to 12, so you're on average between like the ages of 11 and 12 to 17, 18. So in that time period, it's really awkward for any teenager. But then when you
Of course,
combine
yeah.
that then when you combine that with the child of an immigrant family, so there's a massive culture clash, and you put that in, the Western world where a lot of the children have a lot more liberties than you do, and you don't, it's you struggle to understand and even appreciate why that is. it's very, like I said, awkward because you're trying to, remain respectful to your own culture and understand why ours is so different, all whilst realizing that everybody else has, so much more quote unquote freedom, if you like. And yeah, just trying to manage that, it's really challenging.
I can imagine. Like, I guess so many other classmates probably didn't have to worry about that in any way. Like maybe they just felt one way and that was it, and that like problem solved. Whereas you probably felt very different from that.
Yeah, so most of, like, for example, most of my friends were allowed to go on all the school camps. They were allowed to go to the school
Oh,
dances. They were allowed to have boyfriends. They were allowed to sleep over their friends' houses. They were allowed to go out with their friends at the weekend, all to which every single one of those things, bar camp, there was, like, I think 2 camps my mom let me go on in school, but everything else I was never allowed to do because, and my mom for context is the Arab. My mom's the Arab, my dad's the Irishman. And in our culture, in Middle Eastern culture, we don't our children are not given a lot of these, Western, if you like, freedoms. So
right.
those things that I mentioned are usually reserved for the time when the especially the daughters come of age and get married and things like that. So yeah, that was a really hard time. Like you said, a lot of my friends never, not they weren't all my friends, but a lot of the people I went to school with didn't understand, how come she's not dating anyone, how come she's not allowed to go out with us. And yeah, it's a struggle because at home you're fighting with that issue, and then at school you're fighting with your friends to try and prove that you're cool and it's all good, and it's
Right.
horrible. It's actually, let's be simple, it's horrible.
Right. Having to like moderate that, or like find the balance point of all
Exactly,
of
that's
that.
what I
Yeah.
should have called it, moderate.
And I remember I asked you a question last time we talked, that I really wanted to repeat here because I loved your answer, which was, what did your school lunches look like
Oh.
usually?
So like I said, growing up with the Arab mum, a lot of my lunches were the food would be very Middle Eastern influenced. So a lot of the time I would either have anything and everything that was thrown into what we call khubz, like our bread, our traditional round bread. In Australia, we tend to call it leb bread. And yeah, so whatever, maybe let's say the night before we might have had something, with chicken in it. It might be shredded up and put in with like a salad or something into the roll. We call them kebabs. We might have had like,
Right.
falafel, which is like those the green vegetarian. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Love them.
We put them into a kebab. And if not, also, I'm pretty sure I did mention the last time, my parents separated when I was really young, and
Hmm.
her second partner is from Nicaragua. So a lot of
Right.
the cuisine at home was really influenced by Central American food. So I used to have a lot of
Wow.
rice-based dishes. So if I didn't have those type of kebabs, so to speak, I would have, rice and beans or rice and tuna, and things like that.
So you, at some point you might have had a gallo pinto kebab.
Gallo pinto, yeah.
I
Gallo
love that so
pinto.
much.
Gallo pinto was probably the main staple for breakfast in our house.
Oh,
If we didn't have a kebab with anything and everything inside it, the other
right.
dishes that I would be sent to school with would be like a container of gallo pinto and something. Maybe it would be tuna or anything.
I see. I see. Perfect. Great. So I don't know. I'd like to talk about another thing that one thing I really like about your content. Watching like your comparisons between like your Arab and Irish side is how you constantly flow between different accents when you
Oh,
speak. Uh, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that, if you don't mind. I wanted to talk to you about your journey with accents. I know how like sometimes will go into an Irish accent and then back to your Australian one, and then to like an Arabic accent as well.
yeah.
So like, tell me more about that.
I get this question a lot. A lot of people, inquire as to how my accent, my changing of accents happens so easily. And I feel like it only happens easily because I was exposed to these accents growing up. I can't, just chop and change with any accent. But definitely because growing up, I was listening to what we call my teta and my jiddo, my Middle Eastern grandparents a lot. So I picked up on their accent. And then, of course, with the
Mhm.
Australian accent, well, that's my accent. That's what I've grown up around. And then with my father,
Right.
well, they were all born. I'm the first person in my father's family not to be born in Ireland. So they've all got an Irish accent. So it's just the
Right.
exposure. So then it's just easy for me to pick up on it and then imitate it. But oh, see there's a fly. But yeah, so aside from that, it's just easy when you've been exposed to it since you were young.
Of course. And I mean, I guess like beyond being able to like do it as well, just because of your exposure and because of your family and all of that, is there an element of like it, of kinship perhaps, or like of ownership, of like really fight it being one way to express that side of your culture as well, as in not
Yes.
necessarily like saying like this is how my Irish family speaks, but also like me being Irish is also a part of me, and this is like a way to express it.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it's more relatable, right? Anybody when who's trying to, even if it's in a short video, anyone who's trying to, express any level, any element of relatability, in my case, connecting via culture, it just adds another layer of depth to it. When you want to express how your parents would act, if you can express that in exactly how they would have sounded, it just adds another layer of relatability to it. So yeah, definitely, and it enhances it 100%.
Of course. uh I, I wanted to ask you also about, I guess I find it interesting how you've talked about your journey with your two cultures that like form you, right? And so I guess, could you tell me a little bit more about how you like how you've developed into, really absorbing each one of your cultures? Like, were there moments in your life where you felt more towards one and then towards the other, and how was that like discovery? And
But yeah, basically, I feel like anybody that grows up with a mixed background goes through that somewhat of a struggle where they trying to figure it all out. And I, at least in my case, I went through what I'm going to term phases, where I obsessed over one for a period of time and then over the other. So initially, while I was living with my mum, I obsessed over the Irish culture because that's what I was missing. And
right.
I would do whatever I could, whether I'd ask my mum to get me books on it. And she did bring home one really nice big book once, I remember. And, any shows, any songs that I could get access to on the television. And then when I moved in with my Irish family as I got older, then I started to go through what I'm going to call my Middle Eastern phase, when
Mm,
now I was obsessing over, learning as much as I could about the historical aspects. I'm much older now, so my approach to this phase was different. And,
I see.
learning about our traditional dances, our language more. I enrolled into a course at university to try and study it more. And yeah, so that balance came as I got older, after I'd gone through these phases growing up where I would obsess in one at a time. And then I've now, after immersing myself and then absorbing what I'm going to think is the best parts of them, I've just brought them together to create that
Right.
balance.
Oh, I love that. I feel like that's so interesting, and I guess also relatable, in that like you're always like missing what you don't have, right?
Exactly.
So I wonder, I don't know, in retrospect, do you think that now, looking back, when you were with your mom and you were missing that Irish side, and then vice versa, like looking back, do you like recognize the things that you did receive at those times that you maybe weren't like thinking about, or because you were sort of like, yeah, missing the other part, and obsessed with the other
Oh
side, like?
yes, yes. Actually, it wasn't until I became a content creator that I realized that. Once I became a
Right.
content creator, that's actually what triggered a lot of the Middle Eastern phase that I was mentioning. I spent
I
so
see.
long living with my mom, obsessing over my Irish culture, and then when I started to be a content creator, I wanted to make videos about my experiences growing up, and then I would see other creators from a similar background doing the same thing, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I went through that growing up. I can relate to that. I remember I didn't really think much of it at the time growing up, but I remember my grandparents doing that. I remember my mom talking like that. So yeah,
Right.
definitely, that definitely happened as I got older.
Yeah, and speaking of that, I wanted to ask you about. I mean, obviously, a lot of this content can, for a lot of people, it can be just so fascinating to see, a cultural upbringing like yours from people who don't share that culture. But I
Yeah,
wonder if for people
definitely.
who do, some things might make it like very relatable, and the humor is, of course, in the relatability, right? So how do you
Yeah.
construct like your content to make it relatable and to like showcase those things that other people who have grown up like that will recognize in your, for example, your Arab mom, uh,
Yes.
skits, or in any other part of your content.
I feel like with my content, I first of all, a lot of content creators eventually all have to accept this. We can't be relatable to everyone. We can't
Right.
get, that it kind of goes hand in hand with that saying of not everyone's going to like you, right? And
Right.
once you accept that, then it becomes a lot easier to have more of a niche in your content, and that enhances your relatability again. So for the people, especially for a creator like me, where I've got both, an Irish, Australian, and Middle Eastern audience, I do have to provide context because I don't want the people that are there for the Irish content not to be able to appreciate the Arab content when that's being,
Right.
put out. So in my captions, a lot of the time, I will explain things that I feel like need an explanation. But with, for example, when you were asking, about it makes it, the humor makes it more relatable. I have realized in my time creating that a lot of people find a level of peace in that humor. So for example,
Mm.
with the Middle Eastern culture, growing up, a lot of us that are, like I said earlier, the children of immigrants, we feel really hard done by, so to speak. And
Right.
then when you watch this content, all of a sudden you realize you weren't so alone anymore. And then
Of
now
course.
all of a sudden you've got that online community where you feel more connected, and you're like, oh my gosh, it wasn't just me, I wasn't alone in all of
Of
that.
course.
And so it's a nice thing. There's a level of, yes, humor in the relatability, but also peace.
I guess especially if, as you were saying earlier when you were talking about your childhood, like if people who watch your content didn't grow up with a lot of people from Middle Eastern families, right? So I guess if they felt lonely at some point growing up, they see all of this and find out all the other people, or find out that at least one other person went through the same thing, as well as
Yeah.
everyone else, like reacting and reading the comments and all of that, right?
Exactly, and actually through the comments, I've realized as well that there's so many similarities between cultures, which is, I love discovering this when I make my content. And I get a lot of people that are from, somewhere else in Asia, or somewhere else in Central America, or somewhere else, in
Hmm.
Africa, where people go, oh my gosh, that was the same, my mom was like that too growing up. I'll often
Right.
post something about my, for example, my Arab mom or my Arab grandmother, and in the comments, I'll see so many people saying, "Oh my god, that's like my Filipino mom," or "Oh my god, that's like my South African mom." I've seen so
Right.
much like that.
Yeah, and I guess especially like even like in my case, like Latino moms are also like that, right? And
I
have like
see
this
that a
very,
lot.
yeah, like very strict, very like when we were talking about like, no, you're not allowed to go to the sleepovers. Like, yeah, I guess a lot of Latino moms are also, uh,
Yeah,
yeah, very similar.
I feel like I don't, not on a personal level, just from an exposure sense. I witnessed a lot of I grew up more with my Nicaraguan stepdad than I did with my Irish dad. So
Right.
initially I had such an intense exposure to the Nicaraguan culture long before I did my Irish culture. So when I see people commenting saying, that their mom, their Latina mom is exactly the same, I can totally understand because I saw it
Yeah.
growing up as well.
Of course. So, continuing on with your content, I wanted to ask you, what role does fashion play? Because I see, of course, that you show a lot of your dresses, like the way you do your hair and
Yeah.
like the colors you wear and all of that, and the specific the clothing that you wear. Just could you tell me a little bit more about like the role that that plays and how that plays into your cultural expression and identity as well?
I guess as any content creator, as you grow with the experience, your content grows with you. And after I'd spent, 2 plus years making a lot of content about culture, it kind of diversified into, I started to talk more about religion. And then after that, I started to talk more about, and it kind of, I guess, comes a little bit from religion, for me, a little bit, but it can for a lot of people come, a huge amount of it can be influenced by religion. And so then that stemmed into what I talk about, modest fashion.
Right.
Why? Well, I guess in my Middle Eastern culture, there is a huge influence there from that. I the main reason I decided to do that, and I consider myself a spiritual Christian, and in my conviction as a spiritual Christian, I felt like that was what gave me a huge level of comfort. There are other
Hmm.
things that influence that as well, but just to put it simply, I liked I like, first of all, the aesthetic of it. I think it looks great, but also in terms of functionality. Let's look at the other aspect, the opposite end of aesthetics. In terms of functionality, I just think it gave me an element of feeling more empowered. I felt like I was more in control of the image that I presented. I felt a lot more. Actually, I felt a lot less, I should say, exposed, and that made me feel inherently comfortable. I was trying to come up with another word there, but comfort really
Hmm.
is the main achievement there.
I see. Yeah, so I guess it's just a matter of like of your personal preferences, but also like the way that I don't know, like a certain religious influence as well, but that
Yeah.
goes beyond that, and also just your personal preferences in the way you dress and yeah.
First and foremost, it's a personal preference. 110%, it's a personal preference. But I did like, see, for context, online, I represent what I feel, and a lot of people feel is a minority, which is Christian Arabs. So,
Hmm.
majority of Arabs are Muslim, and so a lot of them, whilst I relate culturally a lot to their content as well, and a lot of them in return as well with mine, there is a portion of
Yeah.
the content that I know a lot of Christian Arabs online talk about how they don't feel like they're represented. I wanted to contribute to the representation of Christian Arabs online. And I thought, especially seeing as I was now talking about my religion as well as now my interest in modest fashion, that it would be appropriate to tie the two together and to allow that representation to intertwine. So, for example, a lot of people don't know that in Christianity, modesty can be a big thing. Not always, but it can be. So I
Right, of
found a lot
course.
of people felt like they had a voice online where I would talk about the fact that some of us wear veils when we pray, some of us choose in our conviction as
Hmm.
Christians to adhere to a modest fashion aesthetic. So
Hmm.
yeah, they gave an element of representation to, like I said, what a lot of us feel is a minority, a group of people that are at present a minority. So yeah, it was
Right.
nice to be able to develop into that kind of content.
Of course, and I guess also, well, for one, to think of like this, obviously, like very negative stereotype of Islam being like this very, very conservative religion and all of that. Like, there, I guess there's some truth to that, but like, obviously, that's not a monolith, right? And so there's definitely not one way to be and all of that. But then I guess I find it interesting to sort of debunk that stereotype in a way, and also I guess show that there's a way to dress modestly and also dress very stylishly and like really think about fashion and be very fashion forward in the way that you're most comfortable with while also being modest, right? Like those things are not
I
mutually.
I will say, first and foremost, my priority when it comes to talking about modest fashion online is ensuring that, despite the fact that I reference the influence that it can have from religion, that it's not meant to be a forced thing. If
Right.
It's definitely, like we were talking about before, just a personal preference. But then, secondly, I feel like accidentally I don't want to toot my own horn here, but I feel like accidentally I debunked a lot of what you were just saying in my content, where I know that there's this big argument online about Islam being quite conservative, and that's a separate topic.
Hmm.
But when I started to bring light to the fact that there are Christians that also choose to do a lot of this, that
Right.
debunked exclusion to Islam, and a lot of people were starting to go, "Oh,
Right.
no idea that Christians wear veils when they pray too. I had no idea that Christians
Of
wear
course.
if they wish." And I could even talk about all three Abrahamic faiths and say that that's also present in Judaism.
Yeah,
So
of course.
I liked that. I liked the fact that it took away some of that sting, so to speak, of it all being
Yeah.
heavily emphasized on in one religion, when actually that's not the case, and allowing people to have exposure to Christians having this sort of mindset as well, should they wish, was really good. It gave more of like I mentioned before, that voice. It was good. I'm really actually glad I started doing it.
Yeah, of course. I guess like I think of like these thoughts that exist around like the hijab and like the different
Yeah.
times that it's been banned in different countries, or there's been attempts to ban it, and all, like the whole discourse around that, which is of course incredibly complex, right? But yeah, I love what you say about that, that like it, like, yeah, Christians also can also do this and can also pray with
Yeah.
the veil and all of that. I think that's very memorable.
Yeah, when I posted that video the very first time, talking about how some Christians veil when they pray, I do remember a lot of people in the comments that were Muslim were saying how nice it was for people to start realizing that it wasn't just them, that it was other people as well.
Right.
Which I'm sure there was a myriad of reasons why they felt that way, but I do remember in terms of what you were saying, that they all were also appreciating it too.
Of course. So I guess moving to another part of your content, or just about your experience. If I understand it, you're a teacher, right?
Yes.
Yes. So could you tell me a little bit about how your multicultural background, if it does, is it a resource? Is it a resourceful experience for your students? Do you find that like maybe it makes it easier to relate to them sometimes, or how is that experience?
Well, especially for where I used to teach. So I used to teach, for the most part of my teaching career. I was in a high school in an area where there were a lot of migrants, particularly
Hmm.
from Asia, and especially the Middle East, in my classes. And
Right.
so, yes, I definitely feel like as a teacher, that was a great, as you termed it, resource, because it helped me with an element of relatability, not just in content creation but also in the classroom. And
Right.
it's good in the sense of empathy, it's good in the sense of connection, because the children didn't feel like they weren't so misunderstood. And I definitely,
Yeah.
I do remember this full circle moment, because I know how much I felt misunderstood growing up. I know how much I used to get, my teachers used to get frustrated with me when I didn't hand my permission slips back in to go to these school dances or to go to the camps, because I wasn't
Oh
allowed.
yeah.
But I now, as a
Right.
teacher, I could be a lot more empathetic to my students when they weren't allowed to do whatever it was, because I understood the
Mm.
culture. So yeah, and I, in school, growing up, I can imagine this never happened, but I can imagine that people would have gotten into trouble if they were speaking in another language. Whereas, now as a teacher, that's something that didn't phase me. I just think there's, like, don't get me wrong, I had a lot of awesome teachers. I don't mean this in a bad
Hmm.
way, but I do think there is definitely, when there's a cultural connection that provides,
Right.
like you mentioned, relatability, it allows for a lot more empathy, which is a nice vibe to have in the classroom.
No, of course. Yeah, especially like as you said, like you personally went through that, and I guess in some way you are like the teacher you would have liked to have at some point, right?
Well, I was, yes, that's actually why I became a teacher, funny enough, but not for those
Okay.
reasons. So
Okay. Okay.
the teacher I would have liked to have had wasn't necessarily because of cultural misunderstandings. To put it simply, I didn't have, the environment I grew up in was abusive, and I'll just put it in that blanket term. And then now I've
Right.
when decided to become a teacher, I decided to because I know I was so misunderstood as a kid, and I thought it would be nice to become a
I see.
teacher that I didn't have growing up. I know that sounds cliche, but it's cliche for a reason. And
No, yeah.
when I started working in this school, it was in an area where unfortunately there was a lot of problems like this with my students. And so that was the full circle moment. That was the moment where I realized now I was able to give to my students what I desperately wanted when I was growing up. And I would be a lot more understanding if their homework or their assessments weren't done. I would I'd have more discretion, and when it would come to reporting things back to parents, I would open up my classroom at recess and lunch and have that safe space for them. And that was a whole experience unto itself, like the being the teacher, sitting on the other side listening to the student when I can remember being the student opening up to my teacher. So yeah,
Right.
very, very much a full circle moment.
Okay, so continuing with the question, for people who aren't as exposed to both of your cultures on both sides, I guess it might sound like Irish and Palestinian, Irish and Arab are two very, very different cultures. Like people might consider them like almost even opposite in some ways, right?
Yeah.
Uh, I wanted to ask you, are there ways in which you have found that they like surprisingly mix well, or maybe not mix well, but like are similar in some things, or like, yeah, things that like you wouldn't have imagined they have in common so much?
Yeah, well, first, yes, you're right. I like they are very different, and I do know I've noticed online sometimes people get frustrated because they think that I'm pitching the two against each other, and I portray the Arab side to be the nasty side and the Irish side to be the happier, more positive side. And it's not necessarily
Right.
that way. It's just in some contexts, unfortunately, that was my experience. But yes and no. I am more inclined to say that they are more different than they are alike. However, yes, they can be alike. I know it's probably too much of a stereotypical answer, but when it comes to hospitality, when it comes to for example,
Right.
feeding people, they can be quite similar.
Oh yeah.
The Of course, the Middle Eastern people are known for their hospitality. When it comes, they want to feed anyone and everyone and in abundance.
Yeah.
And I noticed when I was in Ireland one year for Christmas, every single place that I went, as soon as I would walk into the door, would you like a cup of tea? Would you like some biscuits? Would you like sweets? And as soon as you come in, straight away, they also just want to feed you, but in a different way. So I guess that's probably
Right.
the first similarity. And again, on the back end of hospitality, their communal nature. With the Middle Eastern culture, they do like to get together and do a lot of things in a community, and the Irish are quite similar. Again, for different reasons,
Right.
perhaps, but they're very communal people as well. So they're probably the two most alike things.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that very much. uh Great. So just to end this, we'll end the interview with a couple of quick lightning round questions just to see what
Okay.
you think about this. What would be your favorite Irish snack and your favorite Middle Eastern snack,
Um, my favorite
if you have
Irish,
one?
my favorite Irish snack, probably be potatoes. Okay, or potatoes. Maybe I have to say it with the accent for it to sound more right.
Okay.
Potatoes. I have in true Irish fashion. I have an obsession with all things potato, especially chips,
Awesome.
or crisps as they would call them. So I
Right.
love a good packet of potato chips. Ah, I could give you my favorite food in my Middle Eastern culture, but in terms of snack, um, look, we eat a lot of like what we call bizzard. We eat a lot of seeds, so I want to say pumpkin seeds because
Okay.
I love salt, and the way they roast them, they're covered in salt, and
Awesome.
ashamedly, I eat the whole thing. So that's probably one of my favorite things. Yeah, I'll go with
and
pumpkin seeds.
and what's your favorite food?
In my Middle
You,
Eastern culture, mlochie.
yeah.
So for anyone that doesn't know what that is, it's like a big stew slash soup, and it's this leaf that we cook in
Okay.
a broth. So from a chicken broth, and you put like onion and garlic and lemon, and it's just amazing. It's the most homey feeling, and I just the best food ever.
Love it. Uh, so next question: if you had an intro theme song or piece of music that played when you walked into a room, what would it be?
And no one has ever asked me that question before. I have absolutely no idea. An intro theme song. I don't know. I love. Look, I'm going through. You've brought up music. I'm going through an Ed Sheeran phase at the moment. I want to say, because of the Irish influence in this song, I want to say like Castle on the Hill or something like I'm on my way. Just go with that.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the first thing that came to mind.
Yeah. Awesome. Last one. Would you rather be trapped in a romantic comedy with your enemies or in a horror movie with your friends?
Oh, Jesus Christ. What a question. A romantic comedy with my enemies or a horror movie with my friends? I feel like I'm going to say a horror movie with my friends. I despise horror, but I feel like we could turn it into a comedy. I feel like we could survive that. I don't think I could survive a romantic comedy with my enemies.
Love it. Yeah. Well, I think that's it. Thank you very much, Bernadette, for your time and just for being open and like sharing all of this with us. We're big fans of your work and we want to see more of what you do.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and just finally, if anything you'd like to add about something that you're working on, or of course, like where can people find you online? Anything else that you want to share?
I am working on a few things behind the scenes, but nothing that's at all ready to talk about. But if anybody wants to find my socials, I'm on pretty much all platforms, and it's just Bernadette.Kirwan and Kirwan with a K. Whoops. Going out with a bang, apparently.
Thank you very much to Bernadette for opening up to us about her upbringing, her own journey to embrace her cultures, and her struggles to find the best way to celebrate them and share them with her audience online. You can follow Bernadette on Instagram and TikTok at bernadette.kirwan, so make sure to check out her videos. Remember, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Ochenta Podcasts and on TikTok at Studio Ochenta. You can also watch this season's interviews and more of our shows on our YouTube channel at Ochenta Podcasts. Thanks for listening.